Okay, guys, welcome. This is Agential Topics. This is a meeting we have roughly once a month, and it's sponsored by Talking Octopus, which is a nonprofit that is formed to build a physical model of agential biology. And as part of that project, we have meetings where we discuss what agential biology is, and we try and discover a new theory of life, cognition first theory, and related topics. So today we have a philosopher named Yogi Jäger, and today we will dive into his work and see how it relates to the conversation that has been developing here and see what we can learn. So, welcome everyone. Welcome, Yogi.
Thanks, Charlie, for having me.
Yeah. So, my thoughts were that we would kind of start with a general theme that I've read a lot in your papers and other posts and on your seminar on YouTube and stuff. Dealing with computation and the sort of what I think of my bias. I think of it as a metaphysical question, but maybe you will educate us that it's more empirical than I thought. The question of whether um, computation can represent all of nature to begin with, and then you know, I guess an even harder form of that, or a harder push there would be there are people who believe that all of nature is a computation, and so yeah, I just wanted to ask you about that and how do you think about that, and why is that a theme that I see in your work, and what work does it do for you?
So first of all, yes, it is a metaphysical question because what the philosopher Dan Dennett said that there is either science that has a metaphysical stance or science that doesn't take its metaphysical stance on board. But everybody has metaphysical assumptions. And the funny thing is when I'm actually a biologist, empirical, um, evolutionary systems biologist by training. And when I talk to a lot of my colleagues in biology, they would deny that there's any sort of metaphysics behind the idea that the whole world is a machine. And the idea that the world physics is computation is just the latest incarnation of that view that, the clockwork universe. And it's sort of funny if you look through history, it's always the latest technology that we have, clocks in the 17th century and today the computer. That's wow, AI is boggling our mind. And now we think the whole world works like that. But if we look back at the history of the idea of computation, it's a theory about a human activity. Turing and Church, when they invented the theory of computation, when they talk about a computer in their paper, it's a human being. It's usually a woman who's underpaid and sitting in the back of the accounting department and doing the calculations. So that's not a machine. The machine only comes later. So through Turing's universal machine, abstract model of that human activity, we get the von Neumann computer architecture, we get actual computers, physical computers, and we get this sort of funny twisted history of is physics now computation? And the short answer is physics is not computation. To think that physics is computation is actually completely absurd. Now, the other question is, and that's a different question, can we represent everything in nature by computer simulation? Can think about the waterfall. There's this famous example. It goes back to philosopher Hilary Putnam, who said, does the waterfall compute, right? Well, the waterfall only computes if you make a simulation of it. Then it falls, but then the water doesn't fall anymore. Then it's just bits in your computer. That's the other problem. If you have a perfect simulation of your bike, can you ride it to work? I mean, that's the kind of simple questions that we are not getting right anymore. It's sort of the ultimate delusion that we've maneuvered ourselves into. And I would say so mistaking the simulations that we do, that we impute on the world for the reality is sort of ultimate map and territory fallacy. So we're mistaking the map for the territory. Computation is, first of all, a model of a human activity. And nowadays we can explain a lot of what's going on in nature by computer simulations, but we sort of mistake that for the real thing. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'm wondering, I mean, I know there's like a simplistic version of that, um, that is not helpful in understanding nature. Um, but let's try and steel man it. Like, maybe the world's not a simple computer. And like, I wonder, like, making, making the strong claim that it can't be a simple computer or it can't be a complicated computer, with a lot of like, extremely unpredictable inputs. Um, what work does that do for you, like in your philosophy, in your worldview? Like what work does that, what does that open up or illumine, um, for you?
So my idea is the computational models are useful tools that we use to, solve problems that we have or to understand processes that happen in nature. Um, but ultimately, all knowledge that we have, and scientific knowledge included, comes from our encounters with the world. Okay, so it's us, a limited being. We barely descended from the trees, and we're here, and we're going through our world, and we're interacting with the world, and collectively, we've come up with this activity that's called science, which is basically just a continuation and a more systematic way of how we got to know the world before. And the way we do that is we systematically model it, including with computational tools. But in a way, experiments are also models. We simplify the world by putting it in a lab, and we focus in on a few variables, and we tweak those, and we keep all the other variables constant. So this activity is fundamentally a modeling activity. And now we think suddenly the model that we have of the world is the real thing, right? But what's really happening is that we're continuously adapting those models to the world. So
Hmm.
this is my view of how science works. It's sort of always incomplete, but adaptive evolutionary process that's based on our collective and individual encounters with the world. So if you make this flip, right, then so think about the world as a simulation. There's this idea, Nick Bostrom's idea, that we live in a simulation. Okay,
Hmm.
so it's two problems here. First of all, what is this simulation running on? Right? I mean, code is symbolic, so it has to have a sort of a substrate. It has to have a physical substrate that it runs on. I don't know any code that runs. If we think of the brain as a computer, the brain, by the way, is also not a computer at all. Of course, the brain can compute because the theory of computation is a theory of a human activity, but it's not evolved to do that. It's evolved for you to solve the problem of relevance, or to realize relevance, to know what is the right thing to do in a given situation, and also to connect to other humans to ultimately reproduce, to put it in a very Darwinian way. So that's what the brain evolved for, not for computing. So in a simulation, there's no such thing as, emotions or value, right? I mean, it's just symbolic computation. Computation is syntactic, value is semantic. You live in an environment and some things are good for you. If you're a bacterium, even the sugar is good for you, the toxin is bad. If you're not alive, if you're a computer, if you're a simulation running a computer, there is no value, there is no relevance, there is nothing, there is no life in a simulation. That's one problem with the simulation hypothesis. The other problem is, who's the simulator? This is not philosophy, okay? This is a religion. It's the same as Laplace's demon. The Laplace demon that knows, if it knows everything about the universe at a given moment, can predict everything about the future, it cannot be part of the universe itself. So it's outside the universe, and the simulator is outside the simulation. What is that? That's just a sort of a techno-babble version of God. I'm sorry, that's a sort of a supernatural concept. So these ideas, they fail as metaphysics, and they completely fail in terms of their explanatory power. That's the other thing. They don't explain anything, right? The idea that the world is a simulation. What does it do for you? It doesn't do anything for me, but it doesn't do really anything for anyone I've ever asked about what it does for them. But it seems an attractive notion for certain people. It's hard for me to understand.
So, like, I agree. The idea of a world as a simulation is just kind of a, like, just a toy to play with or whatever. But I have heard a lot of pretty serious people say this, that like they talk about this thing called the Turing principle, which is like this idea that, um whatever physical reality is, it can be rendered to an arbitrary level of precision by a universal Turing machine. And so, like, to me, the way I hear that is like it can be our models may not be perfect truth, but they can almost infinitely approach the truth and get closer and closer to the truth. And that's a sort of, to me, I hear that as a sort of optimistic epistemology, that like we can make progress and our models can make progress at describing reality, and they can make infinite progress. They can keep getting closer and closer. And so I could see a value, I can see a value in holding that view until something specifically refutes it, like proves that it's impossible to get a better theory of the universe, that or a better computation, or I'm kind of conflating those two things. But how would you deal with that? Like, I've heard people say,
Mm.
oh, it's a property of math, it's a property of physics that it can be represented as in an algorithm.
Yeah, so these people are stuck in the map, right? I mean, the most beautiful example maybe is Max Tegmark, who think whatever is in math is real, and that's just really weird upside down. I mean, math is a language that humans invented to describe nature. It's very successful, but to think reality is math is just utterly bizarre. I mean, for me, we are biological beings. We're limited. We're in the real world. And so what we're talking about here is in both cases, the machine view, the computationalist view, and my view. They do the same thing. My view also says we're going to get better and better at knowing our way around the world. Whether we know the ultimate truth or not is an irrelevant question for a limited being. But we find our way around, and we get better and better at finding our way around because science is an adaptive, if it's done right, an adaptive process. But the idea that you could know everything about the universe, that's what people want to get out of this idea that it's just computation, right? We want a theory of everything. And I think it's completely absurd to assume that we, as limited beings, can know everything about the world. And think about that day, we know everything about the world. What do you want that? We can all go home and there's nothing left to discover. Fortunately, that's never going to happen, right? Because we are going to be exposed to all kinds of new simulation situations. The world is probably going to evolve and emerge into ever new states and types of organizations. So the future is radically open, and science will never run out of problems. I'm not really afraid to lose my job because of that. If I had a job, actually, I'm freelancing, so that's even better. But this what is behind this idea? I think it's an urge, it's an emotion, to be in control, to have power over nature, right? And you see this in many ways in which this manifests itself in today's Silicon Valley. It's a prime example of that. We want to be in charge, and and the other thing that's behind that is a sort of a transhumanism that thinks it's a salvation myth for the modern age. I think it's a almost religious thing, except that the gods are replaced by machines that we build ourselves. So basically, our world is quite bad, and we're gonna upload ourselves, take our evolution into our own hands, and go to heaven, basically, which is somewhere out there in the cloud, and the cloud is on a spaceship flying across the galaxy. That's the modern vision. That's my reply to you would not be to defend my view as a scientifically proven view, but just to say that this is it's just a myth and it's based on nothing. So the idea that the world is a machine or is a computation has no empirical support. First of all, it's a sort of a weird idea. It's a Platonic idea. That's the other thing. It's sort of assuming that the laws of nature are a construct that we've made up and is pretty robust for predicting things. And I'm happy with it. And I try to stick to the laws of physics when I make theory very much, more so than many of my biological colleagues. But it's not more real than the reality we experience as human beings.
For those of you that joined a few minutes in the past few minutes, I was saying I was going to ask a few questions to kind of open up Yogi's views on like various different topics, to kind of get those on the table. But as I'm thinking about it, like right here, if you guys does anybody have questions that they want to jump in on this particular angle? Because I want to move to like teleology and process philosophy. And I was thinking maybe let's kind of be here for a minute if you want, um, does anybody want to?
Charlie, I just put a question in the chat that you can ask now or
Cool.
leave for
Go ahead.
posterity.
Go ahead. Ask away.
So, Yogi, I read all of the papers that Charlie posted, and I'm struck by your sincerity in approaching this really difficult problem of the computationalists have all the funding.
Yep.
And it seems it's interesting that Charlie brings up trust philosophy. I was also thinking about integral and spiral dynamics, in the idea that maybe the computationalists just have to wear out their mind, and then they'll open it to the intuition and they'll be able to see the higher level of truth. And I asked a question related to this.
Mm-hmm.
It seems like the computationalists just stuck in this trap of science being based on an infinite regression of presumptions we can't subject to a robust and falsifiable hypothesis. Popper calls us to, turtles all the way down. So they're really kind of left with a variation of Dennett, who I can't believe I'm referencing because I have an allergy to him. In other words, acting as if, for example, all we are left with is acting as if sentience exists, or perhaps just composing better prompts for our own reality simulator, to use the DALI as a metaphor. So it seems like they're stuck in this, infinite regression.
Absolutely. So that's a great question. Thank you. Because I am also, well, then it is interesting because his idea of an intentional stance, so we can also segue over to Charlie's interest in teleology. This idea that you should assume that the world is a machine, but then the intentional stance is one of Dennett's book titles, says we should treat living systems as if they had goals and values and intentions, because they behave exactly that way. So yeah, so what I would reply to that is exactly what you said. If your world system, your metaphysics gives you this sort of need to make up an as if, that you have to pretend things are happening that are not really happening, shouldn't you rethink your metaphysics instead of assuming?
Shouldn't you go a little deeper in your presumptions?
Yeah, so instead of thinking that what you're seeing is not real. And the other example that I want to what you said before, like David Hume thought that you couldn't prove that causality exists because it's just one thing. He saw one thing happening after the other. I wonder if he got out of his armchair ever and actually hit his toe on the door jamb, because that's causality directly experienced. And so what you said about integral, I'm really interested in that. It has its problems and it's rather cultish dynamics sometimes. But one thing about these kind of...
kicked out of integral, so...
good. Yeah. No, I mean, not good, but
oh, no,
you're not offended if I criticize it. Okay.
Oh, no.
So
kicked out of integral for not being part of the cult.
So the problem is that, I mean, one of the things that these practices do is they bring you out of your head back into your body. And I think one thing that Western civilization really got itself stuck in the last 100 years, the philosophers, both on the continental and the analytic side, is this: philosophy is about language. Experience is about, even human experience is mostly not about language, okay? And we have an art and science project, which we dedicated to Wittgenstein and his idea that whereof you cannot speak, thereof you shall be silent. And we said, you have to speak of our experiences that are embodied and direct of the world. And this is a crucial difference between a living being and a computer. In the computer, the software and the hardware are maximally separated. In your body, the software and the hardware, if you can speak of that, let's think of the genetic code as the software, are maximally integrated. So you do have direct experience. You're constantly experiencing your environment directly by doing stuff in it. And we have to get out of our offices, our rooms, our heads. And then if you're out of your head, you would never develop computationalism in the first place. I mean, that's a philosophy for people who are stuck in their head. And again, Charlie, I'm not meaning computational models as a tool that we use. They're very good at actually simulating a lot of stuff and understanding a lot of natural phenomena. But once we make that switch of going from the tool to the worldview, saying the world is like a computer, or in Seth Lloyd and other people's case, it is a computer. That is a big switch that is completely upside down. It's completely map, not territory. It means that we have come up with a theory of how the world works, and we mistake that with how the world actually works. Yeah, I don't know if that actually answered your question, Mary, but...
Well, you were just agreeing with me. I mean, we're just having a little. I mean, I
Exactly.
want to ask you a question about holons and if you follow the logic of holonic, um, uh, the holonic philosophy that um, sentiences or consciousness or intelligences are nested and that the nests are fluid. Then you can't really be a computationalist as well. And the question that I tried to ask Michael Levin before he told me that his work was too important for questions like that, and he shut me off, was if you were truly believe that consciousnesses are nested, should you be reaching out to the holon that is humanity and asking if we really want to have a world that's populated by an infinite number of frogmanders and
Okay. Yes.
you know what I'm saying? And so I feel like computationalism allows you to be unethical in a specific way.
I agree with that because it makes machines out of ourselves, and it
That's right.
Allows you to see the whole of nature just as a system to be exploited and manipulated. Yeah. And so that's an ethical dimension of the whole thing. I mean,
that's right.
That's hugely problematic. Obviously, we are not going to find our way out of the meta crisis that we're heading into without changing our attitude towards ourselves and nature in this way.
Right.
And I think that's very profound. Yes. I mean, there is sort of a problem that I have with the nestedness of mind. So I'm an evolutionary biologist, so I'm really firmly, and an emergentist, so I'm firmly convinced that minds are indeed, they have evolved as
wow.
in individual organisms, agents. But of course, even bacteria communicate and humans communicate. So there is an extended cognition that's going on between individual human beings. And in the human case, we cannot even exist really without that, right? I mean, we suffer greatly if we don't have that. And who we are with greatly influences what we think and who we are. So there is this dimension. I am very skeptical of any sort of panpsychism because I think it's sort of preventing us from asking the questions that we should ask about the evolution and the emergence of first agency, then cognition, and later on minds, conscious minds. I mean, whatever consciousness is, I'm going to refuse to get into that discussion too deeply because I certainly don't know what consciousness is, and I don't think anyone else does.
Well,
but it's there. We know.
Religionistic principle that keeps you from interrogating is not going to be useful in the end.
That's so my stance. So I wouldn't. It feels good to think we're all part of a bigger mind, but I don't think it's useful for me for my work. And because I try to be agnostic about these kind of ideas that are very metaphysical sometimes, but then I can't bring myself to do it, and I'm just sort of a non-believer. So that's not a rational decision.
Well, this level of philosophical and ethical and personal moral interrogation is sorely needed. It's almost an emergency of philosophy, I think, at this point in biology.
I think so, and it's absolutely not happening, and people are buying in greater numbers than ever into some pretty delusional ideas, and I think that has to do with both our need for a positive salvation myth. I mean, if you look around, the myth of our time, as John Vervaeke has pointed out, is the zombie. And it's very accurate about our zombie society, but it's never, there's only one zombie movie. I watched a lot of them for my art project, and the Warm Blood one is the only one that it's really a teenage comedy, not a zombie movie. All the others don't have happy endings, and we need a happy ending. And the other is this need by some people. I love an open universe and emergence and unknown future, but some people have this need to be in control and have power over nature and other people. And it's attractive to that kind of person who includes, of course, some pretty powerful and narcissistic people that are very dangerous at the moment.
Well, that is a good segue, I would say, to teleology. Perhaps.
Charlie, can I just before we segue, can we stick with this just for a second?
Yeah, go ahead.
So I just wanted to, intuitively, I'm very much on board with a lot of what you're saying. At the same time, I wonder what you say to just the idea that, we keep discovering these very mathematical relationships between things in nature, right? So just from Newtonian physics to just anywhere you look, things seem to just line up in this way that's very easily describable in a mathematical way. And it doesn't seem to me that it has to be that way. And so I just wonder why, I wonder how do you deal with that issue? How do you deal with the sort of presence of so much numericity in nature, in terms of your idea that it can't all be computation?
So that's a great question. The unreasonable effectiveness of mathematics,
Yeah.
kind of problem, and that is, I have an answer to that, which is evolutionary. So basically, the mathematics we developed suits our world because we developed it to explain our world. Okay, so it's also a bit tautological. But imagine, I think this is Carl Sagan's example. Imagine a bunch of blobs, intelligent blobs that develop on a gas giant. How would they develop geometry, right? It wouldn't be the Pythagorean principle and triangles. It would be probably topology first, because they don't have any sharp edges in their environment. So with us humans, the development of geometry went very much like there's almost 2,000 years between geometry and topology, and so it would be a completely different evolution. The question is, would we converge on the same principles? Maybe, but we wouldn't, because there are patterns out there that are not in our minds. They arise out of the interaction of any intelligent being with a certain world, the world we live in. And so I'm writing about this in my book also, which is called Beyond the Age of Machines. I'm putting the chapters up on a website. I can send that to Charlie if he hasn't sent it out already. And that is, so for me, there are regularities in the interaction of any limited intelligent being with a world like the one we live in. And reality in this view is sort of the part of your experience that is not in your control, right? That's sort of, so you control how you access that reality. And so we construct mathematics to access that reality in a certain way. So it's no wonder, because we've constructed mathematics well, that it works.
Dina, did you have a question, or did you have a? Oh, you're muted. You're muted, Dina.
Thanks. If you say that if we've evolved our math basically to explain our world, how then could that evolved math explain things that we've never anticipated or interacted with?
So the philosopher Bill Wimsatt has a nice diagram that I would display if I had it here already, where he says, okay, what is the kind of world limited intelligent being can actually evolve in? And he says, well, the top one is completely ordered. Can't have any life in that because life is pretty messy. The bottom in the figure is completely random. You couldn't survive because you couldn't actually predict anything and make a living in that world. So the world we live in has to be somewhere in between. And what that means is there have to be patterns actually that can be defined. Category theory, for example, has this concept of naturality. So there's a kind of a pattern that you can mathematically describe. It's really interesting, that we can pick up out of an environment, right? And so there is a certain regularity, even to the regularities that we can pick out of the environment. And that's an argument that you can probably empirically investigate even. Hasn't been done yet. But so when we encounter new situations, it is often the case, but it doesn't always have to be, because the world is radically emergent and there could be something completely new coming. I hope not, because then we're a bit out of our depth. But it happens that as we encounter new phenomena, as we increase our reach through building new technologies and measuring devices and things like that, we come across the same kind of patterns. So in category theory, this is called universality of patterns that arise from completely different. You can interpret that in physics as the same behavior in physically very different systems. So this is extremely fascinating. But if you think about it again in evolutionary terms, we couldn't have evolved if that weren't the case, if there was no predictability to this world, if it was completely radically unpredictable. then we couldn't even live here. But the world is, to all to the best of our knowledge, open, in the sense that there's every once in a while there's stuff happening that we truly cannot predict, right? And evolution is actually a process that is sort of building up this kind of true radical novelty that is not computational, because if it were computational, you could, in principle, simulate it. But simulation always happens within a set of rules, but this is the emergence of new rules. We call it organizational emergence. Stu Kaufman has called it the radical emergence. It's his idea of the evolution into the adjacent possible. So the idea is that you cannot have any formal theory that pre-states what's going to happen in the future in such a system, because the rules are not clear. They're indefinite. They're not definable. And this is what I mean by a large world, living in a large world. This is a world where most problems have to be defined before they can be solved. So actually making sense of the world as a living being means A, realizing relevance, and B, when you've realized what's relevant, picking out the problems and solving them. Yeah. But a lot of people, especially in the computationalist camp, think that intelligence, for example, is only about solving problems. Okay, that's completely wrong. It's about, think about the different kinds of intelligence you can have. That the people who are best at IQ tests and solving problems are often really bad at reading the room. They have no social intelligence at all. They have no skills, practical skills in many ways, right? And so these are all aspects of intelligence that add up to a very complex notion of what it means to know your way around the world. And so I think these are important aspects that are often lost in our current discussions, especially about AI. Sorry, I've completely digressed from what you actually asked by now, but I hope I answered your questions in the beginning of my answer.
That's okay. Kim, did you want to say something? Did you have your hand raised for a moment?
I didn't, but I think it's interesting, based on what you were talking about, where there seems to be some kind of fundamental category error between in the belief that because humans invented math, math will hereby tell us what we need to know about humans and outside of humanity. So I'm still mulling on that. No question, just you're getting the wheels turning.
So I'm not saying it's not a self-fulfilling prophecy. I'm saying math is it's the outcome of the same process that makes our scientific knowledge evolve and adapt to our natural environment, basically.
Yes.
Yeah, it co-evolved with our empirical knowledge. Yeah. So these arguments are all a bit uncanny because they're circular. But this is why we have all these spirally. I should acknowledge Marcus Neistat, the artist who did these spirally figures so this was our idea. It's not very mathematical, but it's our idea of showing how explanations can be circular, but not in a vicious way. If you go around in circles, but you spiral, you go somewhere, you evolve into in a certain direction, then it's not viciously circular. But these are circular arguments, and I don't know who said it before. It's models all the way down. Even a bacterium has a model in a way of its environment, and science is just a more sophisticated version of the bacterium distinguishing between sugar and toxin. Basically, it's a bit humbling, but it's also comforting. It's part of a bigger process.
Yeah. Awesome. So now a perfect segue.
Into teleology. Yeah.
Perfect segue into teleology. So your paper outlined this theory of reproducers, which is very refreshing, a lot of which I agreed with. Especially the idea of anchoring evolution and the process of life at the level of the individual. So it's not explaining life in terms of alleles, allele frequencies and populations, but in terms of individuals that make choices about their lives for individual reasons. And so can you just elaborate that a little bit for us? Because I have some questions about it. So why do organisms pursue goals? How do they develop goals?
Yeah, so I mean, that's a bit of an accident, right? Because of the kind of way that a reproducer life cycle has to be organized to exist in the first place. So let me sort of make a little digression first and say, so most of these kind of theories of biology and that assume that there's just a replicator at the heart of biology. So you have to have a copying, a templating process. There's this vice director of research at Google who just wrote the book about life that's sort of starts with the sentence evolution is an algorithm. That's basically where I stopped reading. So this idea is that you have a copying process, you have some symbol processing, and that is creating evolution is completely mistaken, because there is no molecule that we know of, and thermodynamics and kinetics, chemical kinetics tell us there will be no polymer or molecule that could carry information that is like that. I mean, I'm always careful when I say that could not be. According to our present knowledge, it's very unlikely, I should always say, when I say there could be no. So there could be, it's very unlikely that there is a replicator that can actually reproduce or copy itself and produce the kind of variation that you need for evolution by natural selection, right? So the argument of the reproducer is that you need this kind of very specifically self-organized life cycle to get the kind of variation that you need for what is ultimately one of Lewontin's principles, basic principles of evolution, the principle of variation. So it needs to create a kind of variation that selection can work on. Now, the problem is that you can have systems that are too rigid, like autocatalytic systems produce too little variation. They can't, such networks can't evolve, because when a reaction falls off the network, it just goes extinct. So they are naturally attractor based, and they fall back to a given attractor. But a replicator will soon undergo error catastrophe and just degenerate, or will also, it will not evolve either way. So the solution to this problem is an organism in which this replicator is just a particular coding process. And the coding process fulfills the role of memory in the bigger organized system. It stabilizes certain variables that are passed on from generation to generation, but you don't necessarily need it. You could have an organized system without a replicator that is a reproducer. So, okay, now I'm coming to the answer, don't worry, to your question. So the reproducer has this very specific type of self-organization that is not cybernetic feedback. I have to stress that 100 times. It's not just feedback. What you have is a bunch of processes that are constructing each other, mutually constructing each other. So cybernetic feedback can happen between processes that exist independent of each other. But in this case, these processes don't exist without the existence of all the other processes. So they build each other in the cell. We're just writing a paper. I'm writing a paper together with biochemist Jannie Hofmeier to explain this kind of constructive embodiment, okay? So in order to get a completed life cycle, you need to have a bunch of processes that keeps themselves going by building constraints. So they're constraining each other. And they're building a set of constraints that is basically self-propagating, or as Jannie would say, self-manufacturing. So you build all the components of the cell, but you also assemble them in the right way for that organization to keep going. And it's really just what is continuous is that higher level organization. So it's basically a cell cycle, if you want to think about it this way. A cell that has to first mature into a grown-up cell, that's the reproducer, that can then make two different cells. And even through reproduction, the organization of those cells remains self-manufacturing. So that process of self-manufacture has been going on, that is going on in your body, your metabolism, the sort of boundaries of the cells that are produced, has been going on since the last common ancestor, and since the first living cell arose on Earth. If that didn't go extinct, and then there was another one that arose. But you know, our first ancestor is amazing. So we have at least 2.5 billion years of continuous metabolism in our bodies. And this is an absolute prerequisite for any kind of evolution through natural selection, because it's the only process we know that produces the right kind of variability. Sorry, that was a bit technical and it was a bit long, but and that is, of course, a self-manufacturing organization, is a teleological organization in that it produces itself.
Okay, so well, that's the point I want to pick on. So,
Yeah.
How do I distinguish these constraints from the effect of genes?
So genes are a set of constraints, but the genes alone are not necessary. Who said it? Somebody, a molecular biologist said DNA is the most boring molecules molecule in the cell because it doesn't do anything. It's just a storage device. Okay. So,
Okay.
and also Conrad Hal Waddington, famous embryologist, said in his 56 book, Strategy of the Genes, you cannot decide whether the genome is making the cell or the cell is interpreting the genome. So there is no information, semantic information. There is no meaning in the genome without a cell there to interpret it. And so this
So let
whole
me just
cycle, yeah.
well let me just put the point a little finer. Like let's
Mhm.
suppose everything in the cell is a gene. Let's just make that statement. Everything in the cell is a gene in the
Okay, but
germline
that,
cell.
yeah.
Like
Okay, but
the
that's,
whole germline cell is just nothing but genes. Like
but
let's
then
just
you're
say
back
that.
to the replicator. Then you're just postulating that there's somewhere a sort of molecule that can replicate itself without help of any other molecule. And that's just not plausible thermodynamically.
But so how does this theory of constraint closure differ from that view?
It differs in that the constraints are not genes, right? I mean, you need all kinds of other constraints. I mean, a very important physical constraint is you need to have a boundary that you produce yourself. And you need to regulate the cellular milieu inside the cell. You need to have chaperones that help the proteins fold into a functional form. So some of these processes are coding processes, and that's what I would call, those are usually connected to the genetic apparatus. But that's what I meant when I said software and hardware are maximally integrated in a cell. So you go from the gene, it's transcribed by an enzyme, a transcription factor, or hundreds of transcription factors in eukaryotic cells, and it makes an RNA, mRNA, and then it docks to a ribosome, which is made of RNA and protein again, and it becomes translated. I've left out many intermediate steps there. And then you get a polypeptide that needs to fold into a functional configuration. It does that because the cellular milieu is regulated. So the cellular milieu itself is a cause in this process, in this closed process. And then that functional protein can bind back to the genome and actually express the gene. So if you think about the proteins, the enzymes, the membranes as the hardware of the cell, and the code that makes the enzymes that produce the lipids of the membrane and the transcription factors as the software, they are one. One becomes the other constantly in the cell. And that's very different from a computer architecture where you have the software maximally isolated from the hardware because it's a von Neumann architecture where you want to run as many different algorithms on a hardware as possible. Does that make sense?
Well, it does, but I think it's I don't think it answers my question. So if I just define a gene as that which causes itself to be reproduced.
Well, that's
Right?
the mistake. That's a replicator. That doesn't exist. There is no such molecule that causes itself to be reproduced. Reproduction is a completely different process. It's
That's where I want to focus. Yeah, that's where I want to focus.
it's
Like,
the
what
constant.
is it about reproduction that's different from replication?
Yeah.
There's some sort of variability there in reproduction, and
Yeah.
replication implies like a very strict fidelity to a particular configuration or a particular
Yeah.
process or whatever it is. And reproduction implies that there's some sort of introduced, like you said in your paper, that ontogeny was itself the source of the error correction that informs the process of reproduction. I'm not getting the quote exactly right, but
Yeah.
I think that was the nugget of the insight.
So what we call ontogeny is very broad. So a single cell can do that. It's just a maturing of a cell into a reproducer the reproducer is the whole cycle. I shouldn't say that, into a state in which it can actually reproduce. So
Right.
a reproducer is different from a replicator. A replicator is just something that copies itself. So it's usually the simplest thing is a templating process like the replication of a DNA or the transcription of the translation of an mRNA into amino acid primary sequence in a polypeptide. And a reproducer is something that maintains its organization continuously. So there's a discontinuity in the copying process. So the template produces a copy that is not continuous with the template, but the organization of the cell remains continues throughout the reproduction process. And so all that changes is not the state of organization, but just that you have two organized systems afterwards. Or actually, when you have fertilization and when a sperm and an egg hit each other, then two systems go into one. That also happens. So it's a continuous process, and it's based on a dynamic process that is investing physical work into maintaining the organization through self-manufacture. So a replicator molecule that replicates itself needs to do this spontaneously, chemically, speaking, and the cell doesn't. It uses up. It's a process that uses up free energy, invests the physical work that it gets out of that free energy into producing new constraints. So the difference between you and a rock is you have to do constant work even when you're asleep to stay alive. And the rock just is, But if you go into equilibrium, you die. So, or to put it, to quote Terry Deacon, I mean, there's also systems that are non-living that are self-organizing, like hurricanes and eddies and candle flames.
Yeah.
What they do is they take a free energy gradient far from equilibrium and they burn through it at maximum entropy rate, right? So they use up maximum entropy as quickly. They burn up the free energy gradient as quickly as possible. What you do is smarter because you reinvest the energy to rebuild yourself constantly. And that is a reproducer, a self-manufacturing cell. And that makes you alive. And that's why things have value for you, because you need to find food and mates and all kinds of things to continue going. And that introduces the teleology, which is, there's no mystery or miracle here. So there's an easy rule. If someone's theory predicts that the organism is teleological, it should also mean at the same time that evolution is radically open. If somebody tells you evolution goes towards some omega point, some target or some aim, then you have to, the big red warning flag coming up here. But at the level of the organism, it's just the way it's organized. It's the organization of matter that makes it produce itself. And that is a teleology that breaks no physical laws that we know of. Of course, we haven't proven that in a lab yet, but it's also empirically testable completely. I mean, it's going to be hard, but you can build a cell like that from scratch. If somebody builds a cell that reproduces in the lab from molecules, then that's proof. I mean, I don't think it would be wise to do that, because that cell is an agent, and has other aims than you. It won't work for you, and it may want to replace you, indeed, unlike the AIs that we have right now.
But so if we're asking what is the source of variation,
yeah,
then okay, well, if we have the cell pursuing the aim of survival and reproduction, then the sources of variation that are in the domain of the individual can't possibly be informed by that outcome,
no, so
right? Because the individual doesn't ever go through natural selection as an individual.
Exactly.
It's only the lineage that experiences natural selection and is shaped by natural selection. So how could that teleology satisfy the sources of variation if that's what we're trying to explain?
So variation is not something we need to explain. Variation happens in such a complex chemical process automatically, right? So this is a regime of chemistry.
Well, if they were random, right? If there were blind variations, we wouldn't need to explain them.
Yeah, I mean, we can live with random variation. The problem is not that we need directed mutations in evolution. We need the right amount and kind of random variation. So random variation in evolutionary theory just means that the source of the variation can be independent of the outcome of the process, right? So it doesn't have to be, I mean, whatever random means, right? Is that quantum indeterminacy? We don't know, or is it just because we don't know how shit happened, and
Well,
that's it.
blind with respect to reproduction.
Blind with respect to adaptation. So it's not a Lamarckian targeted mutation. So you don't mutate to grow a longer neck if you're a giraffe. You just select giraffes that have, by chance, a longer neck. And so the problem here is the amount of variation. So it can't explode like in the Air catastrophe, and there can't be too little. And then the other thing, here's my question. So if you think about your laptop, if you randomly reconnect two connections on your motherboard, is its performance going to improve? I think never, right? Because it's a highly optimized, engineered artifact. Why the hell can you randomly rewire the genome of an organism and you get beneficial mutations? This is an unanswered question. And the hypothesis here is that can be tested in the lab, that it is this kind of self-manufacturing organization that regulates the amount and the nature, the kind of variation that you get, in a way that we can get evolvability out of a reproducer system. So it's not the teleology that makes that, it's the kind of system that it is that produces, that actually represses a naturally present variability, so that it actually works, is stable enough and variable enough at the same time, is on that sort of golden mean that you need for evolution by natural selection, right?
Mary has a question. I think you're muted, Mary.
Yogi, I think you got there while I was asking the question. I wanted to say, can you speak about how it is that constraints experienced by living systems, for example, in available free energy, result in the opportunities for creativity? From another point of view, how entities maximize constraints for teleological ends. I think you were right there.
I don't actually know if we maximize it. I mean, look at human society. We don't exactly maximize creativity in our lives. It's more that it's possible, right? And so people also ask me, if you think that a bacterium is an agent, a bacterium never does anything new, right? It's just got genetically programmed behaviors, and it goes for the sugar, and it goes for the away from the toxin because it evolved that way, and that's just completely automatized. And that's sort of true to a certain extent, but two things don't make sense there. First of all, why did the bacterium evolve to avoid this particular source of food and avoid that particular molecule as a toxin? Is not explained by that. That's just explained by the self-manufacturing organization, because some things are good for you. If you want, I'm always talking very metaphorically here, want to survive, if you strive maybe to survive. And so that's a problem. That's where value comes into the world of a living system, right? And then the other thing is, a bacterium must have done something original and really truly unexpected, because we evolved from something that must have looked like a bacterial cell, although we're not quite sure. Maybe it looked quite different, but it was certainly simple. And so even the simplest of creatures must be able to do something truly unexpected, or you wouldn't get new kinds of organization that you get through the major transitions in evolution, for example, the evolution of eukaryotes, or multicellularity, or the evolution of nervous systems, and new lifestyles, and then new opportunities, or affordances, as you could call them, arise constantly through evolution. So you get really radical emergence. You could not predict when and how these kind of things happen beforehand with any sort of model, that formal model that we could build. That's a pretty radical prediction, but that's because of the nature of those emergences, where new rules come into the world. So at the origin of life, the rules of the world change forever, right? The first living cell in the universe, there's a set of, matter has never behaved like this before. And so new rules come into being, and then also a consciousness, of course, and other such events. So this is not something that can be just simulated within. A simulation always has a fixed set of rules. And of course, the answer here is, but the simulation has a bigger set of rules than we thought. And now we have these LLMs that have so many parameters, and they do amazing things, because we can only keep 7 facts in our brain at the same time, and they can thousands, millions, and so on and so forth. So they seem like magic to us. So a really big parameter space can do a lot for us, but in the universe, in the cosmology, in the evolution of life, the rules change truly radically. And so that's not simulable in this sense. And this is what I think true creativity is. I mean, it's not like there's this YouTube video that says everything is a remix, right? And of course, even in art, most of what we do is a remix. Shakespeare said he was only stealing from other people. But every once in a while, somebody does something that just fits the right way into the context and changes the future of the universe forever. And that only, I think, that is something that maybe not only living beings can do, but living beings enable, the organization of living beings enable that sort of thing and drive it towards more complexity.
Yeah. Richard? Yeah.
Thank you. Yogi, that's been great. Thank you so much. I really learned a lot from what you've been talking about. It's been making me think of things. I've been writing lots of notes and things. Let me just say a couple of things that resonated with me strongly and positively before I ask a question about it. So the software and hardware maximally separated, that in contrast to software and hardware being maximally integrated, that makes great sense to me. That really helps me think about things carefully. And the involvement of almost religious ideology about what kind of a thing do you want the universe to be in motivating a particular way of seeing the universe and wanting to be in control of it versus being okay with it being out of your control, right? Those kinds of questions and that kind of space of thinking about things reaches my heart well. I appreciate that. There was something that you said not long ago that clunked with me, though. So I wanted to see if I heard you right and see if you can explain that a little bit. If I heard you right, you said something like, we don't need, variation doesn't need to be explained. We don't need directed variation. We just need the right kind of random variation. And that seems like a contradiction to me. It's like, if there are kinds of variation and some kinds will do and some kinds won't, how is that not directed variation? I understand that there can be a difference between, say, variation could be in any number of a very large number of dimensions, or it could be just in a small number of dimensions, or within the dimensions that it's in, it goes this way rather than that way, right? So we don't need that kind of direction, but we do need the variation to be on these dimensions and not on those dimensions. Is that not a kind of directedness that needs explanation?
Yes. So what I wanted to say with that is that what needs explanation is the stabilization. So how do you get beneficial mutations? That's one part of it, but also, of course, you cannot have any variation that breaks the living organization. If it breaks the organization, that's something that our field of evolutionary developmental biology has looked at way too little. And I have another book chapter about that problem, is that a lot of the developmental processes that we study and how they evolved were, of course, strongly constrained and shaped by this requirement to keep on reproducing. I mean, that's quite simple. And it's something that geneticists even have known. I mean, most mutations are just dead and not very interesting. Those are usually not studied, the ones that never grow in the first place. But what we study are mutations that do something interesting. And that's what I wanted to say before when I say you rewire the laptop and nothing interesting ever happens, and you rewire the living organism. So this kind of directedness, so living systems are robust in the sense that they can not just, or anti-fragile, to use Nassim Taleb's word. They don't just, they're not just resilient against mutation, they can take advantage. And that needs to be explained through the organization of the organism and not through natural selection. And the other thing that needs to be explained through the organization of the organism itself, that if my hypothesis is true, you cannot evolve the organization, the self-manufacturing organization itself, by Darwinian selection. It has to have arisen before.
That again?
So the self-manufacturing organization of the organism has to be there before natural selection starts. So this is very much a direction in that sense. I just wanted to make the distinction between that and the sort of, giraffes specifically had mutations that make their necks longer. It's more complicated than that. But the fact that the giraffe organization allows there to be mutations that make the neck longer is something to be explained in the first place. So it requires, so what you need to explain is what is the kind of organization that brings that variation out, and it brings that variation out by constraining, again, it's a question of more of stability than where the variation comes from. I mean, that's what I wanted to say. So the process is naturally variable. There are mutations occurring naturally, but what makes some of these beneficial is what we need to explain, and that has to have an organizational explanation. And organization is more about stabilizing the process rather than creating the variation in the first place.
Great,
Yeah.
thank you. A part that resonates strongly with me there is this assumption that if we have random variation, at least some of it will be adaptive. It's like, it so totally won't, right? It's like, you know, anybody that's implemented an artificial genetic algorithm is like, I'm right, you know, if I start from something that is worse than completely random, yeah, there are some beneficial mutations, but they are very quickly exhausted, and then there are none, right?
Yeah.
Even when I have an open-ended space of possibilities.
Yeah.
So yeah, good.
And also, this explains the failure of A-life, of course, because no algorithmic system has these properties of self-manufacture. You can, I mean, you can simulate it to a certain degree, but it doesn't have the radical openness towards the future that people are expecting to get of A-life. The strong A-life program that you literally get living like behavior out of an evolutionary simulation is an interesting indication that there is something missing, and that what's missing is the actual embodied organization of a living being. It has to be embodied. I also want to stress that again. You can simulate that sort of self-manufacturing organization on a computer, but you have to be constructing yourself in the real world to be evolvable. And that's a very important distinction to make.
So if I may continue a little, Charlie. If I heard you right, the self-manufacturing architecture necessary for reproducing has to be there before natural selection.
Yep.
That can't be a product of natural selection. So that's a bit like natural selection can't explain the origin of natural selection, right? Because nothing can explain its own origination, yeah. So that makes sense to me that natural selection doesn't do that explaining. And that the presence of such an architecture places constraints on what can happen next in a way which is interesting. Is there another source of explanation that helps explain how that reproducing architecture arises if natural selection didn't do it?
So that's the million-dollar question, right? I mean, the origin of life gets sort of harder with this, because you have, if you want to have a full-blown cell at the origin of life, you have to have literally hundreds of molecular processes that have to co-arise together. Now, there are some models. I mean, the best one I know is Terry Deacon's autogen, which is just a simple virus-like cycle between an autocatalytic network producing a polymer, and that polymer enclosing the autocatalytic network. But it's neither alive, strictly speaking, nor can it evolve. So you have to make all kinds of ad hoc assumptions about how that went from that could arise spontaneously in a sort of a primordial soup. But there's still a humongous gap between that and an evolving reproducer. So I would say, if you want a real challenge in biology today, go into the and ever in the past as well, if they can go into the origin of life. I mean, this is a really tough problem. But so compare that to, actually, this is a funny story. I always find that funny. So Richard Dawkins, right? He explained the origin of life literally by a hurricane going through the scrapyard and assembling an airplane. And then a few years later made in his God book the claim that God couldn't exist because it was just an unlikely sort of occurrence. But by his own argument about God, the origin of life was equally impossible. And so that's just sort of a short circuit in the kind of reductionist thinking that you often get. I mean, these people always get into these kind of troubles, right? And so the fact is that no, we have no explanation how this happened, and but nobody does, right? And that's an interesting question. I would love to see progress on this, but it's hard.
I have one little anecdote that I find resonates with the position that you're presenting here that might be useful to you. I saw a presentation at Harvard Medical School by Kate. No, it's not Amidala, because that's from Star Wars. It's Adamala. It's the other way around, right? Kate Adamala, I think it is. So she does artificial life, wet artificial life stuff, and she's building cells. She's got lipids to make membranes. She's sort of bottom-up designed. Well, I'm going to need this enzyme and that enzyme, and I'm going to need some DNA polymerase, and I'm going to stick them all in the cell and shake them up, and it's going to be alive, right? And she, at the conclusion of her talk, she said something like, well, I reckon I've got all the right ingredients now, but it turns out that it doesn't work very well because all of these reactions are not producing the right products at the right time in the right place. And it's like, okay. So it's like the idea that you could just get the ingredients, put them in a bag and shake them up, and that would give you the organization that does reproduction. It's like that only occurred to you at the end of the project. It's like.
But this is great. Thanks for this anecdote, because this happens in the theory of the organism community itself. They draw these diagrams, Robert Rosen's diagram, or the one from the Mosio Moreno school, and they're all static diagrams, right? And then this is why I like Yanni Hoffmeier's work so much. He's a biochemist, and he says, guys, it's not thermodynamics, it's not structure. Life is all about kinetics, okay? It's about rates, okay? If you don't get the timing right, you don't get life. And I can tell you, I mean, this is why this, to prove, to build an organism from scratch in a lab will be incredibly hard to do. And I think that's a good thing.
It's as silly as imagining if I put a frog in a blender, and then just put all the pieces together in a bag, it would unblend and make a frog. And you know that doesn't work for frogs, but you think it would happen for a cell. Why would you think that?
Yeah,
I'll stop there. Thank you.
Good point.
Thank you so much, Yogi. That's been great. I've got to go now, but
all right.
Wonderful.
Thanks,
Thank
Richard.
you.
Luke, you have your hand up.
Yeah. Hi. Thanks, Yogi. I study the interactional processual model of living process from Eugene Genlin, a philosopher. So the kind of things you're saying, the anti-mechanistic view, anti-computational, the interactional side of things, all of that sort of makes sense. So I'm just come from a generally warm, receptive view of much of what you say. I want to just pick up on something you've mentioned a few times. It's at the end of the paper that Charlie gave us to read, the fourth perspective work, where you talk about challenges, and one of them is empirical. And what I'm not following is why making a living cell, would be an answer to the empirical challenge. Like what, because there's many things we can observe and test and so on. I just want to find out why you're thinking that that's a path to take, given it's would seem incredibly unlikely, if not impossible, at least in any sort of time frame that we have available to us. And it could be many other things. So I just want to sort of hear your thoughts on that. What can we attest? What can we observe? What kind of data do you want to sort of build? And why do you need any of this to be empirical? I'm sure there's reasons for that, but I just want to hear your thinking on that.
Thanks. Well, I don't need it to be empirical in this way. And I think building a cell from scratch is an incredibly stupid idea. If it succeeds, it's very dangerous, and gray goo will eat this all. So I have some questions for you guys, actually, also because of the building, living architecture idea behind this discussion group, maybe. But so I'm happy that you're saying, why do we have to prove this empirically? So there is a certain empiricist in biology who says, if this doesn't give me an immediate experiment I can do in the lab, then I'm not interested. And this is such an impoverished view of how you do science, because your empirical research program comes, as I said before, from a metaphysical stance. And what this theory does of the organization of the organism, it just gives you all kinds of different avenues, not necessarily different experiments you would do, but you would interpret your results in a completely different way. And again, I've written about this, for example, in terms of evolutionary developmental biology, as you think most of the researchers in that field think everything needs to be explained by function. Why the processes are like that is because they make wings, or they make eyes or something like that, but they make a heart. But you also have to take into account that they have to fit into the whole, and that whole needs to be self-maintaining. Otherwise, it's not going to survive. And so that's a big set of constraints that people never look at. And you could actually design experiments, very specific empirical experiments that derive their predictions. I mean, that's also still hard to do, but much more feasible, that you say, okay, it's hard to do in a non-trivial way. In a trivial way, it's been done many, many times. Every mutation that's just lethal is not going to be selected, you know, and we've known this from the very beginnings of genetic theory of evolution. But so it's clear that only those mutations that are either beneficial or just neutral, or only weakly deleterious, are going to have any significance for evolution. But of course, just that is not, that is because of the organization of the organism, but that is not proof or anything for a hardcore empiricist that this is important. And so for a lot of these people, it's hard to raise interest among biologists because it is literally not relevant to their day-to-day work. But their ideology is very interesting. They think if they work out enough mechanisms, and there's a specific field that's interesting to watch. There's a field of whole cell modeling that's been failing to actually model a whole cell for 25 years now. I mean, serious attempts at that, and failing absolutely miserable, and with a lot of money invested. So there are questions there. Okay, wouldn't these people benefit a bit from a better conceptual framework? But there is no interest in that sort of research community in these kind of ideas, because there is the firm idea that I think it was François Jacot in the 1970s who said, we no longer study life in the lab. And for him, that was a sort of a triumphant, yes, we no longer have to give a shit about what life is, but instead can just study 100 million mechanisms, and then the meaning of life, what life is, will spring at us. And so this is the sort of intellectual milieu in which we're doing the research here. And funnily enough, people who are engaged in this theory of the organism, as you said, they're mostly, you know, that are philosophers of biology and not biologists. And the biologists who are interested in this are obviously mostly from the origin of life community, which is very marginal. So it's totally out of the mainstream. So biologists really don't ask what life is anymore. And that's just a bizarre state of affairs for me, to be honest, as a biologist.
Yes, I just want to sort of, do you mind if I just push on one or two things there? Like,
oh, by all means.
Yes, I understand that the mainstream may not have much credence and faith that a kind of, you know, reframe of theory from sort of very ground level assumptions could be of any worth. And certainly, you know, what's it going to do for me in my career? And it's been built on all these other assumptions, et cetera, et cetera. I just, because you ended the paper with that, are you saying that your mentioning of the empirical is merely rhetorical in terms of, you know, that to be taken seriously, it needs to have an empirical basis, and that any good theory, if it's worth its salt, will somehow be able to turn into that which we could observe and test in some manner and operationalized in some manner. Otherwise, what is it? It's just a theory in sort of hot air. It has to sort of do predictive, if not creative, on the ground material work. Like, is that just a general notion you have where you're being rhetorical to try and get interest, or do you personally have a kind of skin in the game of that? Like, do you care about that, or is that for someone else to do? And because there was an ambivalence there, and there's an ambivalence in your answer, and I'm just sort of interested in what you take, because surely you're not invested in this theory merely to say, well, it's one of multiple, take it or leave it. Like, you seem to have very deeply held reasons and almost an ethic and a work ethic of why this would be worth working on. So I'm just wanting to sort of find out where you think it could go.
I mean, so to answer one part of your question, I mean, I think what I presented in the paper and here now is sort of the most plausible explanation we have for life. You know, if you look at more mainstream explanations, this idea that there must have been an RNA world of organisms completely made out of RNA and all this makes no sense to me as a biologist and a biologist who is an empirical biologist. But my personal interest by now is a different one. I'm interested in why we have modeling formalisms in biology that are directly imported from physics and don't get the actual organization of life right. I mean, there's a argument I make in a different paper that you can show through Robert Rosen's work, and also in my book I make this argument that the organism and its behavior and its evolutionary potential are not formalizable. They're not pre-statable. And so I'm, as a former, also as a modeler, we did model and data-based modeling. It's really interesting to see that we don't even have the formalisms to tackle this. And then the last thing is, when you go down that rabbit hole, like I did in my career, you realize we don't have the concepts to deal with any of this. And then you realize we're in deep shit. We have bigger data than ever, but I provoke biologists often deliberately by saying we know less about what life is today than we did 100 years ago, because now we think it's some sort of bundle of mechanisms, a machine. That's not what the organicists thought at the beginning of the 20th century. They had no data. We have all the data in the world now, but we still haven't made any conceptual progress on that question. And this is where, this is my personal story, my skin in the game here. And then the last thing you ask is why do I want empirical proof? I want a theory that's at least empirically provable, because otherwise in my, I'm still a scientist, not just a philosopher. I want a scientific theory of the organism. And for me, a scientific theory in the organism has to be, at least in principle, testable. Otherwise, it's not a scientific theory. I don't know if that answers everything you asked, but.
Robert? You may be muted. I think you're still muted, Robert.
Yeah, sorry.
There we go. There we go.
Hey,
Perfect.
thank you. So maybe I want to float this idea and get a response from you, what you think. It could be called windows of emergence. And you could think like the elementary particles had a window to emerge. Chemical elements had a window to emerge. But once the window closes, no new elements will emerge after that. Like, we can't create new chemical elements. It's just not possible anymore, because that opportunity has gone. So now, moving to prokaryotes, eukaryotes, and then life itself, they might have their own window of emergence. So the window of life emergence has closed. So nothing will be able to create life after the window closes. So all of life emerged, like the roots, the seeds of all of life emerged during a specific period. And that window is closed. So that's my view or my interpretation. Could you say anything about that?
Yeah. So this is I'm really interested in this topic, because so people who think that the fundamental laws of physics are enough to explain the universe and the cosmology and all the emergences that you just described have a problem, because these laws are timeless, right? I mean, you can run the universe forward, backward. There is nothing in there that explains this increasing complexity. And also there has been a bit of a kerfuffle or a controversy lately by people who do assembly theory or constructor theory, who claim that they have found new laws of nature by that explain the increasing complexification of nature. Now, this is a very similar principle from complexity theory that was called logical depth. It's published by Bennett in 1973, first time, and that's the idea that events and objects of a certain complexity require a certain time to evolve. So that gives you an order in which things need to happen in the universe. So you can't get life, I think, before you get chemistry. It's an interesting question. Could you, in the plasma universe, the early, plasma, could you get, people talk about Boltzmann brains and things like that suddenly emerge, but I don't think that's a really interesting thought experiment. But could you get the evolution of something like life in a universe that didn't have nucleosynthesis and recombination and chemistry emerge first? So you got to get chemistry first, then you got to get some kind of macromolecular chemistry, and then you have to have a self-manufacturing cell. That's again my argument against panpsychism. Then you get cognition, then you get mind and consciousness from that. So that's something that emerges in a specific order and in very specific systems. Okay, so in these systems are Robert Rosen has a very interesting argument where he says the rules that apply to life and to consciousness and all this, they apply in increasingly specialized parts of the universe, but they enlarge what it means to understand the universe. They enlarge the rule set, the kinds of organization of matter that exist in the universe. Every time something like this happens, there's something new, and the universe has become bigger in a way. And so he says in this very funny chapter that physics is a very special science. It only studies dead things, and most of the universe is dead, but most of the interesting things in the universe are not dead and are built on living organisms. And so I think you're absolutely right. If you don't have the historical component there, then you don't understand what's going on. And so what's important here is that the evolution of the constraints, or specifically the non-holonomic or context-dependent constraints, this is basically what physics considers boundary conditions, right? These boundary conditions are what describes how processes interact, systems interact with each other. And they're almost always backgrounded in physical studies. So we only look at the fundamental laws of physics, but the evolution of those boundary conditions doesn't necessarily follow. It doesn't break any laws of physics, but it doesn't follow from the laws of physics. So this is what true emergence is like. And there is nothing mysterious about this kind of emergence or downward causation if you look at the universe as a process of increasingly complex organizations of matter that emerge through this organizational emergence that's not computational. So the universe itself is obviously also not a computational process if life is not a computational process. But in the end, I think life is just one of these emergences that cannot be captured by a purely computational simulation.
So
Mary, did you have? Sorry.
Okay,
go ahead.
sorry, one more.
Yeah.
So, like these windows, they seem to be opening and closing and opening and closing. So technically speaking, you could argue that we are again in the window trying to figure out what the next step will be of complexification. So there's going to be, after this window closes, there's going to be another layer of organizational principles added to the ones that are already there.
Yeah, that's an unknown, right? I mean, why should this be? I mean, it's a bit funny to assume that we're the pinnacle of everything, and but what that is completely unknown, right? And as you said, the window also closes, and I think that's, for example, because the initial attempts at life were very fragile, right? And now we have very robustly reproducing life. So I think even if you would make a new cell from scratch in the lab, it would not initially be very competitive out there in the real world. It would die out very quickly. And that's why the window closes again. So you have so many more niches filled, and you have social organisms, and you have consciousness, and you have all kinds of things that are just they cannot re-evolve. If you have a species like humanity on the planet during that time we're here, who knows how long that's going to be, you will not get anything similar evolving. But of course, in the future, anything could evolve or emerge from other parts of the universe that we don't even expect, and we have no idea. That future is radically open. Yeah.
Thank you.
Mary, did you have a question? Sorry. Are you?
Yeah. As usual, my questions are highly divergent from the topic at hand. But I spend a lot of time thinking about the way the perception of self expands and contracts holonically, and that it almost appears that I can't remember who said this. Somebody said this once when I was at Woods Hole, I don't know, decades ago. Humans are the candelabra phrase of eukaryotic evolution, or something to that effect. It's like, what are the goals? What are the teleological sort of like movements of organisms, and how does that change what I mean? Levin calls it the cognitive light cone. I don't even want to use that term because it's so flawed. But when I was studying somatics, we learned that you can focus on the circulatory system and the fluid system and be in that consciousness, and the other people in the room can tell that you're doing that. Once we learned what that feeling is of that consciousness, and you can create a group consciousness of the people in the room where everyone is focusing in the fluid systems, and it changed everyone's behavior, and it changed our physiological measurements. So, and we know that eukaryotes, bacteria are not bacteria, but eukaryotes are brilliant at creating larger levels of organization. So I'm wondering if you can speak to how this sort of like sense of self expands and contracts related to your work. If you
Okay,
can
so
at all.
that's-
Sorry, there's
yeah.
I'm a very divergent thinker, and I'm bringing in lots of different levels there.
There's lots of interesting stuff in there. First of all, what is a self, right? And again, I would say only living beings can have a self. And that's where computational theories of agency, for example, go completely wrong, because, of course, to have a cognitive cone, you have to be a self. And the self is there only when you have a self-manufacturing process. So when you have this living organization underneath. And some people call this a metaphysical argument, and as if it wasn't an empirical fact that we can observe that organisms, living beings, behave in a different way than dead beings. That's the first part. So we have all living beings have a self, in my view.
Right.
So now you can couple these selves together, right? And there's a really interesting concept in autopoiesis theory by Maturana and Varela, which is called structural coupling. So they're basically they're using it mainly to argue against the representationalist view of cognition, where they say we don't have sort of a movie or an image of the environment in our heads. We're just structurally coupled. We're adapted to our environment. And in another paper that we've written, the naturalizing relevance realization paper, we've actually used this idea extensively in saying that so you get sort of a resonance, right, with your environment, and you can actually show that adaptation at the physiological level is continues also with adaptation at the evolutionary level, in that sense that you just have to be somehow the models of the world you have, the expectations in the most broad sense of model, have to be sort of valid in the environment you're in. Otherwise, you're not going to be able to survive. So that's the second step. The third step is then if you're a social being, a social organism, even plants do this sort of coordination dance to their plant pheromones. You get the structural coupling between human beings, right?
Yeah.
And so yourself, I had Sam Harris meditation app, but I got so aggravated by him that I had to delete it. It wasn't very good for the meditation because he always said, you have no self. And that's because Sam thinks the self is a thing, right? So of course you have no self that's a thing. The self is a self-manufacturing process, and that's a circular definition because it has the word self.
Well, I have follow-up questions about the heuristic
Yeah.
sense.
Can I just finish that thought still? Because it's
Yes.
important. So
Yeah.
now you have this process that's self-manufacturing, and it comes into resonance with the beings around you. That changes yourself. That changes your organization. And that, of course, makes you then feel in resonance with people around you as a human being. And it's a very emotional experience. I'm just saying you don't need to have an actual mind meld, whatever that would mean to be, but the structural coupling between human beings in such a situation can be very strong, and that can be inducing very amazing experiences. And then we think we're one with the universe, which we are actually, but not in the way we're thinking. So I think it's quite nice to be one with the universe, and I've had such moments myself. So these are two aspects that we're actually embodied, and we're part of these bigger processes. I love that about process philosophy. When you die, you don't go away. You know, the worms will eat you, and that's a great thing. You know, and this is also. If you have this idea of being one with the world, you don't have to live forever like all these psychopaths in Silicon Valley. And you have a completely different meaning. So you're connected to other beings and the world, not necessarily through a universal mind, but just through the fact that you're embodied in this world and everything is a process. So you're constantly, I tell the kids when I teach in schools, you become what you eat. Yeah, you become what you eat. That you're not like your car, you know, don't just burn through your food. So every time you go to McDonald's, think of this, you become McDonald's.
So this leads up to conversations that Charlie and I have had, and others many a time, about resonance, and Richard. Are there sort of like underlying rules for when you become you have this coupling, that there are certain resonances that maybe can be identified and measured eventually, that identify when we are moving sort of up. Oh, Richard's back. We're moving up and down in our self-perception in terms of the holonic levels. I think that's a very interesting question. I know it's outside the scope of your research.
Actually, funnily enough, my master supervisor, Brian Goodwin, he always talked about the science of qualities. Now, I had the different, he thought we need to make all the qualitative experiences that we have scientific, and I have a bit of a different impression. I think it's a great, why would we want to measure that, right? Because the importance of such an experience is to have it as an individual and not, you know, whatever way you experience it, and not to quantify
Well,
it. So
I think that's also interesting. I think it, I think qualia is probably related to the can be measured by looking at the light emissions and the fluorescences of the various residues on the amino acids of the specific, well, that's a whole different thing, but I do think there's a resonance sort of thing there. I should probably have a conversation with Richard about that at some point. Anyway,
qualia are an interesting concept, because the need for qualia only arises if you think that in the first place subjective experience isn't real, and only what science tells you about the world is real, which is a really weird thing, because science is derived from our subjective experiences in the first place. There's a really good book, I don't know if you guys have discussed it already, Evan Thompson, Adam Frank, and Marcelo Gleiser's Blind Spot, that discusses this sort of misunderstanding of mistaking the first and the third person perspective, and then trying to explain the first person perspective from the third person perspective, which is a bad idea generally. Yeah.
Well, this is a question of embodiment, and the changing perspectives of self is really, I think, it's something that a lot of biologists avoid, because it reduces their capacity to just behave what, if I was very green meme, I would call colonialistically, as opposed to other beings in the lab.
Well, I think there is a deep disconnect when you start to assume that your theories of the world are reality, right? And that's Plato's fault 2,500 years ago. And it was carried over immediately into the scientific revolution. And since then, we think that these theories that we've come up with that are very powerful models of the world that explain a lot of things are more real than the real phenomena that we actually experience in our bodies. And so that's the big mistake. And this problem of also the hard problem of consciousness, or the idea of that you could imagine yourself to be yourself exactly like you are without consciousness, they're just completely absurd. They only come to your mind if you are stuck in your head. I'm sorry. I mean, if you go out and, you know, I mean, not you, of course, you seem pretty grounded that way, but go out into nature and eat some dirt and you know, and
You'll find it
experience.
amusing that the project that I'm developing with my husband is called Philosophy Farm.
Okay, I like
The
that
program of bringing
concept.
people into somatic embodiment and practical action in a day that's split with engaging in the larger philosophical questions.
I like that. I was afraid for a second that you would grow more philosophers.
Well, there's an awful lot of lonely farmers that want to have that part of their mind developed, and there's a lot of philosophers who need to get their hands in the dirt.
Yeah, I like that.
Nice.
That's great. That's a great idea.
Nice.
Good luck with that. That's great.
you.
I love that.
Nice. I think we do have time for one more. Go ahead, Robert.
I don't want to hog the space. If anybody else has a question. Mine is around resonance.
Go for it.
So even if computation is a human invention, wouldn't it still be based on resonance? And that would explain the connection between the computational power to describe all these different phenomena.
Okay, yeah. I mean, it is so. The question is the following: why is human? I mean, all of that computation is based on logic. It's a model of somebody doing calculations. So inferences, basically logical inferences with pen and paper. Originally, the Turing and the Church version of the theory, right? So what are the problems that you can actually solve through logical inference, purely logical inference? And in that sense, it resonates with your being human in a certain environment, because I think just like our math, the logic that we have also evolved in us for a certain purpose, because it's good, it's useful to explain what we should do next in our given environment, right? So, and it's an interesting thing to look at the different kinds of. I have a student, PhD student, looking. He has a chapter in his thesis called "The Logic of Life" at sort of how these traditions of logic explain certain things but don't explain certain others. And one striking aspect of this evolution of different logics is that we first excluded all kinds of processual logic from our consideration. So the early logics are all sort of about categorizing things into strict concepts and then relating them to each other. And then only later, for example, Hegelian dialectics and things like that come up, where you have a more fluid sort of logic. For example, a lot of the paradoxes that you get from very basic logic, like the liar's paradox, if you put it in a process, it's just a negative feedback loop. Even Russell's paradox can be resolved if in certain. Basically, organisms are walking Russell paradoxes, Barber paradoxes. They are self-contradictory in a very deep sense. That's why they're not formalizable. And they can do this because they don't violate any laws of logic or nature, because they are processual. And so we've come back to this idea that we have to consider process and also non-dualistic logics and things like that. And it's interesting to see the evolution of that. So logic, even human logic, is not fixed in stone, like people think, that we have this certain logic by which the world, and also it's a logic by which our brain works and how we explain the world. And we easily conflate that with how the world works. This is the map and territory fallacy, right? So you come up with a really good way to explain stuff, and then you just make this little extra step where you say, okay, because I'm very good at explaining stuff, this is how the whole world works, right? And we've done this over and over and over again in our history. And you do this in your life as well. I've done it many times. Oh, that's a good idea. I have a hammer, everything must be a nail. And so this is really hampering us nowadays, I think. So the resonance with our environment of our logic is because it's been adapted, and that of course leads then all the way down after all these process logics to the Turing machine, and then this twisted piece of history that I told you before. So this is a model of a human activity. It leads to a universal model of what it means to compute. It leads to a machine that imitates that universal model of how to compute. We're very impressed with ourselves, and then we think the whole world works like that machine. So if you look at the whole history like this, it's actually quite a funny story, the whole thing. But it's really confusing for a lot of people because it's a little upside down. And the upside down problem is that we often mistake our theories of the world for the world. I don't know if that was your question at all, but I tend to digress as well. I'm sorry.
No, thank you very much. I do agree that life, to call it that way, can't be explained. It has to be lived. You can't get the same out of an explanation of something as an experience. So it has to be experienced. There's no other way. It has to be lived. That there might be computations going on that are more like resonance. It's a bit like music, like listening to music. We don't say that's a nice relationship, it's a nice interval. We just immediately get captivated or affected by the music without thinking about what's involved, the mathematics of the music, the whole Fourier transformation that you could apply to the music or the sounds. It's direct, it's experience. But in a way, it is computation, but computation through resonance. It is computational, but it is felt. Like maybe our way of how we learn about computation is sort of the archaic way.
I mean, if I understand properly what you said, is that actually how we explain the world, our explanations, if they're scientific, if they're rational, they're computational, right? I mean, because they're logical. They're based on logic. And so that gives us the feeling that then the world becomes computational. But again, if you have a simulation of your bike, like you say, you can't ride it to work. If you haven't had the experience, you just had a description of it, that's not the same. I also like this anecdote of, the billionaire that has his brain uploaded, and I'm gendering this deliberately, to the cloud, and then it's still sitting there in the chair and is asking, what happened? I said, well, your consciousness is in the cloud, but you're a continuous physical process, construction process. You're still here. I can't watch any science fiction with consciousness upload anymore. It's totally spoiled for me. But imagine you live there for eternity. You can't eat, you can't have sex, you can't have any feelings, or because your hormonal systems are just simulated. That's just weird. And so I totally agree with what you said, in the sense that we explain the world through inferential constructs which are computable. So we can probably compute all the explanations that we have, but we cannot come up with a computation of how we come to experience the world and how we come up with those explanations, because those come up through the experience that you just said, cannot be just simulated. Yeah.
Beautiful. Luke, we've got a few more minutes.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
Wrote something in the chat, but I just wanted to pose something which is a solution that this philosopher I study kind of presented and actually worked through in very detailed ways, which is that whilst explanations can never fully encompass, phenomena, so I can go with you very much on that. The process of explaining is itself a phenomena.
Mm-hmm.
and experience. We do experience. We experience the process of explaining, and that process of explaining can be a phenomena that we examine.
Yep.
And so there is a lot to be gained by attempting to theorize, not the universe from the point of view of being a parallel to that which is our explanations, whether they're computational or theoretical or term logic, predicate logic, or whatever, or mythic, as it used to be, but that the process of the fact that we are always in the process of symbolizing and explaining out of felt embodied living is itself a special kind of thing that humans do, and is a resource and a site for being able to think the kind of concepts that theorize and process such that what remains in the concepts that one theorizes is the openness by which we experience the process of explaining.
Yeah.
i.e., we're creative people, we're creative organisms, and that process of creation is part of our living and needs to be involved in as part of the sort of topic. I'm just sort of announcing something. If it's of interest, we could chat about it some other time, or I can follow you up. But what that presents is that phenomenology as a method sort of needs to be remembered for what it can provide, and we can step through things. So we don't necessarily need to computate what the feeling of resonance is. We can just take that really seriously. I feel resonance. What, by definition, resonance is the felt, in a sense, and we can take the felt to be, part of the phenomena. Of course, any way that we talk about the felt becomes conceptual and becomes, in a sense, captured within certain systems. But we can look at the fact that the felt is generative of more and more ways of talking about it, but can never be captured by it, and actually can theorize that as one aspect of the radically open future universe that you talk about.
So this process underneath it all, that's exactly what we need to remember, right? And it is exactly when we forget that, when we certainly hide in our abstract constructions, and Whitehead called this the fallacy of misplaced concreteness, of course. So when we mistake the abstract for the real, then we are in trouble, and we get all these kind of weird problems. But in what you said was also this infinite regress that is life. Again, Leibniz said, oh, living things are, of course, they're machines, but they're infinite machines, and nobody understood what he meant. But what he meant is not that they're infinitely big, but they have this infinite regression in them, which non-living systems don't necessarily do. So it's a beautiful way of saying that you can think about the process of coming up with an explanation, but if you explain that, that's not the explanation itself again. And of course you can also explain that process again, because it's not the same as the actual explanation, and so on and so forth. And so people who want a firm ground to stand on and for their knowledge, and sort of a controllable and limited universe to have power over, they really hate this kind of idea. But if you really go deeply, also experientially into this, and if you maybe have some sort of experiences that help this feeling as well, then you have a completely different approach, because it is much more, you realize suddenly that most of what we experience, even as human beings, is non-linguistic, is not through language. And of course, the whole rest of the creation is experiencing the world without language, probably, or with very limited language. So is that not experience? Is that not getting to know your world? So the theory that I'm coming up in the book, of the epistemology I'm coming up with the book, is really based on a limited being experiencing its world, and then coming up with a way to act in the right way. As in the right way means in a way that is conducive to its own survival. And so this is a very evolutionary view. And so you could say, okay, so you're criticizing people who have a theory of knowledge that's based on physics, but you take your own theory, you're an evolutionary biologist, and you take it as the foundation. But that's not the same thing. I mean, this kind of epistemology does start with phenomenology, and then has not just an evolutionary theory, but also a theory of the organism, of the knower itself, which physics doesn't have, just in a weird way sometimes includes in quantum mechanics. Interesting parallel in physics, by the way. This may be a bit of a digression, but the problem of measurement in quantum mechanics and uncertainty also occurs at macro levels and always has. We cannot measure everything, and we cannot measure anything with infinite precision, even in the macro level world. So we always have a principle of uncertainty because we are experiencing little beings in a large world. And I think if you forget that, that's just trouble. And we are in huge trouble right now. So we don't think we're finite beings in a large world anymore. We think we have everything under control, and everything is going wrong exactly because of that.
Yogi, apparently plants and fungi have language.
So I was in Sweden once where this artist had recorded the plant pheromone. So she had there was a dome in front of one of the...
It's not pheromones, actually, it's an electrical signal, and the electrical signals happen in a pattern that actually has vocabulary, syntax, and an accent, and vocabulary, semantics, grammar, and they can the scientists who are studying this can now tell the accent that's being used, and what part of the country that the fungi who are speaking with that accent are using. So it's I don't know. I don't think they have the ability to abstract it and think that their poetry is mistake their poetry for reality, but they have language.
I thought the music that this artist made out of the pheromone
Yes.
communication was already pretty impressive. With the actual plants in the room, she recorded
Right.
that and then she played it back in the room. So that's pretty
That's
cool. Before I forget, Luke, could you put the name of the philosopher that you're studying in the chat still? I would love to
Totally.
look that up in case I haven't actually come across. No, I haven't come across.
Totally. Eugene
Thanks.
Gendlin. Awesome.
Okay. All right.
Awesome. Well, guys, this has been spectacular. I just want to thank you, Yogi, for bringing so much
well,
today.
Thank you for that compliment.
Yeah, this was just a fantastic discussion. Does anybody else have anything before we close, or I just wanted to, we kind of wrapped it up there a little bit at the end. Yeah, thanks, Anthony. I'm so glad you came.
Thank you so much.
Hey, Charlie, how you doing?
Awesome. Hey, doing great, man. I'm so glad to see you.
I had to kind of work. I had to work a little, so I was popping in and out. So I left my camera off. But it's fascinating, and thank you so much, Yogi. It's always a pleasure to listen to you talk.
Thanks a lot. I mean, I had great fun. So I hope, since some people stuck around till now, I assume you guys had to.
Definitely. Yeah, well, answer Luke's question real quick about email.
Yeah,
and
that's
people want to get a hold of you.
Proton mail. Is there
Awesome.
no typo in there? Yeah, for everyone who wants to contact me. And also, I have a website if you Google my name. And then expandingpossibilities.org is the website with the book on it. I'm gonna put that in the chat quickly too. So
awesome.
Yep.
Fantastic, guys. Appreciate it so much.
Thanks, Charlie, for the invitation.
Charlie.
Absolutely. We'll see you guys all next month.
All right. Bye-bye.
All right. Bye-bye.